Okay, my notes are here. Data flow. We are going to cover parts of this notes, not all of it, because other than talking about the basic topics of Redux, I'm going to do some live coding to to be a bit more involved, to get a bit more involved in using Redux, and specifically redux-thunk, which is a Redux middleware, which helps us set up the Redux data flow much easier. Okay, in this session we are going to first cover some basic, as I said, but and then redux-thunk. But the point is, in other sessions, in the in the next sessions of this series of React workshops, I'm going to cover other Redux middlewares as well, like Saga's Redux Saga, which is another great Redux middleware, and also Redux Observable, which is based on RxJS. So, and just a quick note again, please let me know if you are interested in covering another React related topics, anything. And even if you, for instance, like to talk more about redux-thunk or any other topics, we can do more than one sessions. Okay, just to have some summary, I'm going to go through these notes that I have here. If I had sent a link, and if you have seen it, you might probably have seen all of these different topics, but I'm going just to go through them really fast so that we could go to the main part, which is live coding. So the motivation here, the more I'm a JavaScript developer with around 12 years of experience, and I've been doing this. I've been dealing with JavaScript related stuff for quite a while, but we always have a lot of issues, specifically related to single page applications and the way that we can manage the data inside the browser. And when we say manage the data, this is what we call manage the states inside the browser. So whenever it's not just data. When more complex UI state, we need to manage active routes, for instance, selected tabs and stuff like that, loadings, paginations, all of this stuff are going to be stored in the state. So as we get more and more rich and complicated when creating single page applications, we are going to have more complex state objects. So it's hard, we all know that. So the point is, using React and using Redux along with React sometimes feels sometimes feel frustrating. You have to sometimes deal with a lot of boilerplates, but the point, it gives you a clean way of dealing with state. That's why instead of writing a simple function to, for instance, do XHR request, the way that we handle that, we have to create an action reducer and implement the whole Redux data flow that we are going to cover in this session. Well, there are a couple of topics that I'm interested in covering them in these sessions. One of them is optimistic updates, and the key in a nutshell, optimistic updates means, for instance, instead of when you update something, when you update a record or an object, instead of waiting for the server to give you the success, what you do, you instantly update the object and the UI part of it in your browser, and you don't wait for the success. And if it fails, you are going to roll back. So implementing optimistic updates is sometimes hard using especially using MVC, but using Redux and this whole, specifically the flux pattern is helping us with this. The other issue is server-side rendering that I'm going to show you part of my code, that the way that I handle server-side rendering. I guess one of the most interesting parts of this React technology is React-based technology stack is offering all of these different features with a really simple and clean way of coding. And the other thing is, if we could if we could fetch data before performing route transition, for instance, when you want to go to the next page, before changing the URL, before transitioning to the next page, I want to, for instance, as a developer, I need to fetch data so that initially my page has the data. So this is another feature that I guess is interesting. These three different features could be discussed in parts of my live coding that we have here. So I'm not going to talk a lot about mutation and asynchronicity, but the point of all this is about this mutation and asynchronicity is we need them both. We need mutation and we need to do asynchronous operations. But when we mix these two different topics together in our code, we usually create a mess. So if we don't use best practices and design patterns like Flux and technologies like Redux, we are going to end up having a giant, spaghetti code. So React actually attempts to solve the problem in the view layer by removing asynchronicity, and the other side effect that we have other than asynchronous calls is DOM manipulation. So this is why React is interesting. But the way that we need to mutate the state, this is where we need to have Redux next to our React stack, so that we could have a separate asynchronous operations right next to our not having to DOM, not having to do DOM manipulation and all of these type of issues. So you could read all about these topics if you go through the link that I had sent to you before. So I want to read these three principles. First is, when we use Redux, we have three principles of Redux. One is we only have one single source of truth, one single source of data. We don't, if you have, for instance, a list of users, a list of posts, or whatever data you have, we only have one single instance of that list inside our browser, and that list is going to be inside our state. I'm going to show you in the next part. The other thing, which is kind of the part that somehow separates this Redux from Flux, is that state is read-only. We never change the state. When we use Redux, we are not going to change the state manually. What we have to do, we have to implement the Redux working data flow. Then during this data flow, if we do it right, state is going to be changed whenever it is required. So if you look at this function, in compare with what we used to have, for instance, using a jQuery call. So this is the way that we need to, for instance, handle we could you could use different types of actions, but just taking a quick look inside this function. For instance, when you want to load a data, the main part is this line when you send a request. So we have three different actions here. First is when you want to notify the state that you are about to send the XHR request to the server so that you could load the data. And the second action is where you receive the data. And the third one is when it fails. So in a real world scenario, you are going to, only two of these actions are going to be dispatched. One is this one, which you could use actually to enable a flag so that you could use it to show a loader or a spinner in your code right before you send your XHR request. And this one is just to notify the state that now you have successfully loaded the data. So we are going again, I'm going to say this again and again, we are going to do all of these in the next part of this session. And another important part of Redux is the concept of pure functions. So when we say pure functions, it means that JavaScript has a lot of side effects. Whenever you send XHR requests, you add a side effect to your function, which means when you use XHR request in your function is not pure anymore. And there are different things that could change your function from being pure, one of which is for instance set timeout. Calling set timeout, anything which changes the the way that this stack is working in JavaScript. When you have pure functions, you don't have to add something to this JavaScript stack. When, for instance, using set timeout, what you are actually doing is you are adding a function to the JavaScript stack. So, or one was XHR requests, set timeouts, or DOM manipulations is another type of side effect that we could have inside of functions. We are not allowed to do DOM manipulation when we want to create a pure functions. These are really important topics. All we can do inside a pure functions that we use when we create a Redux reducer is just to manipulate the parameters that we have inside that function, which here, as you could see, which is a sample of a reducer, is just to change this state object and add a value, like you want to set the loading true, as I said, so that you could show a spinner in your components. And this is the action that you have. Based on that action and the type of that action, you could decide whether you want to enable the loading flag, or make it false, or store the data that it has passed. In our previous function right here, when the response comes, use dispatch load data success, and it goes straight to this case, and this action data is actually exactly what you pass here in this object. So the whole thing that you see here, the main important part is, as you see, there is no side effect. We don't have anything like a set timeout, we don't have anything like a DOM manipulation, even local storage. The point is, we can sometimes use local storage, or we can use sync operations, but again, it's not recommended at all. In just, you know, in case you really need that, you can do that, but you have to be really cautious about using any type of you know, any kind of side effect, adding some kind of side effect to your pure function. Anyway, so this is 3 main principles that we are going to use. So the next part, which is I believe is important, just to go through that once, is just to review the whole data lifecycle in Redux. First, everything starts from you have the store object. Everything starts from calling a dispatch function. When you dispatch an action, the scenario, you know, the starting point of this life cycle is dispatch. When you dispatch an action, you know, the whole workflow is getting started. So then we are going to debug every single step after we go through my code. So we have seen it before, you know, in our previous notes file, different types of action for different type of scenarios. The second part is when you call an action, that action, as I showed you before, goes straight to the reducer. It's not your job to handle that. It is Redux that when you dispatch that action, that action is being passed to the reducer that you have created before. So these are examples that I have just copied and pasted from the website. So you could read it, but if you have any questions, we could cover that. But I'm more interested in going into, you know, covering the questions in the live coding part instead. So the other important part is whenever we create a reducer, we can have multiple reducers inside the root reducer. This is the, you know, in a simple application, in a simple to-do application, for instance, you might not want to do that. You might just need one single reducer to do all of the stuff, but it's not the case in a real-world application. So what we usually do, we have different reducers, and every single reducer is going to be something like a nested object, is going to add a nested object to the whole state object, to the main state object of our store. So like this, when you Redux gives us a function called combine reducers, that we could combine all of our reducers into one reducer. And then what you see here means that whenever you get this store, you could do something like store.getState, and inside that state object you are going to have a nested to-dos object, a nested visible to-do filter, 2 different state objects coming from 2 different reducers. So, and as I said, Redux source saves the complete state tree returned by the root reducer. So I guess that's enough. If you are interested, this is highly recommended to go through all of my notes here. And if you had any questions, we could talk about that in the next session. So just let me make sure. Is everything okay, guys? I'm just trying to make sure you can hear me. And awesome. Thank you for this. Great. So let's get into my code. So if you clone this repository, you're going to see this React workshops. Here you have this O1, which has all of my notes, and the second folder is apps, and inside that apps folder I have a user management app. We are going to use this user management app as the as our base code whenever we want to use whenever we want to cover topics related to Redux and redux-thunk, because I have implemented redux-thunk in this application. You could clone this application right now or later, and all you should do then is just to do npm start. So just to give you an heads up, this user management app is an application that I have created using React Starter Kit. I'm going to just, it is highly recommended to use React Starter Kit because it saves you a lot of time and a lot of pain. If you set up the whole React core by yourself, you have to then learn all of the best practices in the world so that you could have a great setup. But using React Starter Kit has saved a lot of pain for me. So I guess all you should do then, if you don't, for instance, need GraphQL, you could remove it. Or if you don't need any part of this technology stack other than stuff like Webpack and Node.js, you can almost remove everything. And of course, Express is also another part of this kit that allows us to have almost all the best practices that we need. The other interesting thing about this React Starter Kit is it also has a feature/redux branch, again for those who want to set up a React/Redux based application. So it again saves you not a lot of time, because after cloning that repository and checking out the Redux branch, you have to again do a lot of stuff. But I'm going to cover parts of those stuff. So here, this is my application. What I'm going to do is just close everything that I have here. So this is what you see here. This is the main skeleton. This skeleton has all of our code inside the src folder, almost all of our assets. For instance, if you need any icons or touch icon and stuff, fonts and css files, you could add them all here. And okay, just by the way, if you need to, for instance, add bootstrap, you don't have to add it here. You could add it here though, but you could use npm to add the technology to your set. So just to make sure, the first thing that we have to do is just to go through the open the package.json, and as you see, it has a couple of interesting stuff here. The dependencies. These dependencies, as you all know, are those dependencies that our application is using in runtime. So application needs all of these dependencies to give us all the features that we need in runtime, not in the development mode. But dev dependencies has stuff like, for instance, Babel, which is a JavaScript compiler or transpiler, allows us to write ES6 code instead of the old JavaScript code. And a lot of great stuff like ESLint and Zine, which is a React, not specifically React, which is a testing framework for us, but it is heavily used along with React. So Mocha post CSS for our CSS codes, as you see, and these all are different plugins that are Webpack. Inside the tools folder, you could find the Webpack workflow over here, and all of these imports that you see here, for instance, the Webpack itself, assets plugin, Webpack bundle analyzer, and different things that you see here are exactly, the way that if you want to set up the scaffold out your application by yourself, you have to write these codes by yourself. But this is what React Starter Kit offers us, so we don't have to deal with this part at all. All we have to do is just to clone the repository, change the branch, and just run something like npm start. So what I'm going to do before jumping into the code is just to run the application. Okay, npm cd, this is the application, npm starts. What npm start does is it launches the application in development mode, which means we can debug that, we can add breakpoints, we can debug the application, and it's much easier to deal with. This is the initial interface of the application that I have created for this session, so that we could cover. And what you see here is, for instance, this is the home that we have users and groups. The concept behind these entities is just again, two different entities, groups and users, and I have tried to set up the whole skeleton in a really general way, so that we could, we usually have to implement a CRUD, for instance, when we want to create any type of application. So here we have two different CRUDs, one for users, the other one for groups, and the other one, actually the third one, is for handling the relationships between groups and users. You could see the list of groups here. If you click here, super users, administrator tasks, and users over here, you could create a new user over here, and also you could add existing users to your group. And also, as you see here for groups, you could see the users count. So I have really tried to show you what it means when we say Redux allows us to have just single source of truth here, because the whole tree here has all groups and users. So let's just jump into the code. So the first part, okay, let's just open the home page. As you see, there are two users, which means it has loaded either the list of all users or the count of the users that we have in database, and three groups in the system, and also the number of groups. So the first thing here that we have to know, okay, where does this all come from? Let's just have a look at the server side. What I have done, I have created a Node.js API here inside the APIs folder, which is, if you are interested in talking about Node.js, Express.js, and using yield keyword specifically and promises, we can talk about that in another session. But this is how and where I have, for instance, set up a REST API. This is the REST API for all of these actions: index, create, show, update, destroy. For instance, whenever we want to get the list of all users, this is the function that is being called. And if you want to just see how it works, if you open the server.js file here is the APIs. So if you just then here go to localhost 3001 APIs, for instance, list of all users. This is, as you see, the list of all users, which is a JSON file, JSON object. So, or if you change this to groups, again it shows you the list of all groups. Or if you, for instance, copy an ID from here and click, and what it does, it just shows you all the information that you need for one specific group. This is exactly the way that REST works. So, okay, this is all we need. We have a REST API to get us started. So now what we want to do is to set up a CRUD using React and Redux, so that we could use that to show data inside our application. Okay, let's see. If you remember, the first part, the first principle in Redux was, the first point, the starting point of this data flow in Redux is where you dispatch an action. Okay, this is where I usually start the whole data flow. Whenever I want to create a new data flow, I go to src in actions folder. As you see, I have this groups.js file, but I want to create another one here just to show you how I usually do that. Groups, we have the actual one that is working, groups live.js. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is to load the data. Okay, so to load the data, we can't just set up a pure function. We have to create a function like, you know, the function that I showed you before in my notes, the load data function. If you remember, let me just copy that function and paste it over here and change that. So let's go to my notes. Okay, over here, the Redux data lifecycle. Excuse me, the other one, 3 principles of Redux. This is the function that I was trying to find. Okay, let's paste the code over here. So this is a function. What I'm going to do is just to change the name to, okay, this is the name of this function, could be anything like load groups or load user groups, because this group means a group, you know, each group is a list of users. So load user groups, what it does, it just sends a request to something like APIs/groups, as I just showed you. So what we have to do first is just to say, to dispatch an action, load group, excuse me, groups request. So this is the first action, which means whenever I dispatch this action, I want to, for instance, to enable the loading flag so that I could show some kind of spinner or loader in. This is load group requests, load group, for instance, success. This naming convention that you see here is something that I usually use. So you could use your own naming. You know, you could have your own conventions, you know, naming conventions for your actions. So, but I believe these are going to a bit more clear. So, success, failure. Okay, as you see, we have here $.get. So instead of $.get, React Starter Kit allows us to, you know, use something called fetch API. So what I'm going to do is just to if you just open this core folder, you could see the fetch here, and it has two different JS files. One is for your browser, the other one is for Node.js. This is again where if you use just $.get, you are not going to have server-side rendering, because dollar means jQuery, and jQuery works only in your browser. But if you use fetch with this trick that you have, fetch.server.js right here using node fetch. Again, I haven't created that part. That part is coming from the skeleton that I have used from React Starter Kit. That's why I really like this starter kit, because it just out of the box has all of this feature already implemented. So anyway, this is the main function fetch that we need to use. If we import that like this, import fetch from, okay, where we are inside the actions folder. Okay, one step back, core, and inside that core we have fetch. That's it. So this, if this code runs in the server based on this package.json file, the main would be the server.js, and if this code runs inside the browser, then it's the other file is going to be the one that we use. So this, you see here, this module is the polyfill that we need for fetch API. If you just open the developer console in your Google Chrome, you could see that here you have this fetch, but this you see here. So this fetch, let me just open another NP page. Okay, as you see, this fetch is already here. So, but in some old browsers, you don't have that. You don't have fetch in your browser. So then that's where this module helps you. So all you should do is just to import that. So again, you don't have to be worried about that, because this is where React Starter Kit helps you. So all you should do is just to import that. It is, the interface is not really difficult. So you should fetch this here. What it does, it returns a promise instead. So what you should do here, you should, let me just cheat, if you don't mind, and copy parts of my code from the other side. This is the real function. Okay, let me show you something else. I have already implemented all of this Ajax calls inside my utils APIs folder. So if you, for instance, open the groups.js, you could see the groups API. So groups API load group users over here. It uses fetch, as you see here, core fetch, and this is get user groups to get all of the user groups. So this is group API path, which comes from, I have created a conf.js here to store all of my URLs to have a bit more cleaner code. So okay, this is a function that I need to call. Instead of calling $get or fetch, all I need to do is just to import my groups API and specifically this function, get users groups. So okay, what I could also do, okay, let's go back to the code here. Let's import that. Import groups API. this is where I can cheat, and let's say you don't see that I'm cheating. Okay, so groups API dot, okay, get user groups. What it does, it returns a promise, so we no longer have done, we have done, and instead of fail we have catch. Okay, so okay, and then the other thing is I could use lambdas over here. I know because I'm using Babel, so to have a bit more cleaner. But okay, if you look at this code, we have a missing piece, which is the store object. I don't have it. One way is just to, let's say, okay, I want to do something like this. Store, I want to pass this store object, because inside your component you are going to have access to that store object. So store is inside the context of your store, you know, of your application, and inside your component you have your context, and inside that you have the store. Okay, you could pass that store over here. So again, it's not that clean. What I could do to make it a bit more cleaner is to, what I've done here is to create different pure functions for just my actions. So this is where we you know, what we are doing here, we are setting up action creators. So let's say, okay, we usually export all of our action creators. So what an action creator does, it's not that difficult. It is just a simple function. Let's say load groups request. So that's it. So what it does, it could receive something, a parameter, and what it should do is to return the action object. So again, you don't have to do this. This is the way that I recommend, and I believe it's the cleaner way of implementing actions. So oops. Okay, for this action I don't need anything. The other thing that I should create is I need 3 functions. One for request, one for success, and one for failure. Okay, as we know, when you call the success, you need to have something like the response object, and this response object, or as I have called it over here, I guess data. Let's name it data. So okay, data, or this is how you could do it using the new features of JavaScript. So let me just change the name of the action as well. The other one was failure. Okay, error object. I am going to, when I dispatch the failure, I'm going to also send the error object along with my action. Again, error, or just error. So now my code is going to be a bit more cleaner. Okay, load group users. I'm going to dispatch load group user request. Why I had to do this? It allows me to have a cleaner code and have access to this specific function in my other components and actions as well. So okay, instead of this one, as you see here, I could remove it and use what was that? Load group success and pass the data like this. If you just take a look at this code, what it does here, this piece returns the action object. And again, let me remove this one as well and replace it with load failure and error. Okay, awesome. So why don't we use async await keyword? Okay, if we want to do that, we could also do it this way. Let's just say, let's then rename it async load user groups. So what we could do here, we could create an async function. So what is the difference? This is again another, excuse me, it should come here, async keyword. So now instead of using this then and catch, what you could do is just simply like this. You see this data? You could create a variable. Oh, you could create a try catch first to catch the error, and here you could say, for instance, okay, let data equals this one. Now all you should do, instead of using .then and passing the function, is just to say await and this. These two pieces of code are exactly the same. So then here you could do, you could dispatch your code exactly like this, and here when you get the error, you could dispatch the failure. Okay, it's a debatable, you know, concept that we see here, that we could use async await keyword instead of using the old way of using promises like then and catch. And again, what it does at the end, it returns, if you want to, you know, want the whole function to work as an actual you know, promise-based function, what you should do here is just to return the data, and over here is just to again return the data. These two functions are exactly the same, using two different technologies. One is promises, the other one is using async await keywords, which is again under the hood. Async await is being transformed into the same exact code that we have written over here. Just the reason that we use here sometimes is because of the nice looking code that we have here. If you prefer to use this one and this one, it doesn't matter. All that matters here is this, you have to choose which one works better for you. Okay, this is, and again, where redux-thunk helps us with is exactly this point. As you see, I have created a function. Okay, I have to export this function and also this one, because I'm going to use either one of these two inside my component. So the point is, I'm going to use these group, load user groups function. I have to pass the store object. What if we could just create a function which knows exactly what is the store and type of function that could have access to the store object? That's where we could use redux-thunk. Okay, let's pause right here. We have set up the initial state of our actions for groups API, and now the next step, actually the previous step before that, is to set up redux-thunk. But the my first assumption is that was that we didn't have redux-thunk yet, so now we are going to add redux-thunk. So as you all know, Redux gives us something that we call create store. All you should do is just to import create store, then at the end we are going to use this configure store.js file as a module inside our code. For instance, let me just show you. We have two different files, server.js for the server parts over here, which is using configure store here to set up the store for the server-side rendering purpose, and client.js again over here, which uses configure store to set up the actual store inside your browser. So let's see how it works. So the initial state, okay, if it is just all this, we don't actually need to create a configure store.js file, because all I do over here is just to call create store, which doesn't make any sense to create, you know, a whole module just to do this. But we usually need more than calling just create store. We want to add middlewares like redux-thunk. So okay, and the first thing that you should notice here is a root reducer. We haven't covered that part yet. I'm going to do that in the next step, but I want to just show you how you could create the actual store, have the actual, how store is being created is using the create store of our Redux module. So we set up this is the first part that we have to do. Now I want to add redux-thunk so that I could have a cleaner code base in my actions. So let's just before I do that, let's just head into redux-thunk right here. This is the repository. You could read the documents about this thunk, this middleware. All you should do is just to add this npm install redux-thunk, and you could add it to your dependencies by adding this parameter --save. So as you see, it has different features. One of those features is the way that we could composite our composition. Okay, if you see, there is this thunk object which allows us to apply middleware. Apply middleware is again another function similar to create store, which is coming from Redux. So if you want to create a store using a middleware, what you should do is to use apply middleware. And now this is the way that we could add thunk middleware to our store, so that our store could recognize the different features of redux-thunk. So for instance, one of those features being this type of functions. This is why I really like the whole thing. Redux-thunk allows us to create asynchronous functions. As you see, a function which returns a function, and one of the only parameter, not the only, the first parameter of that function is dispatch, which means I no longer need to have the store object. This is the main function. I'm going to show you how to use this. So let's just go to the second step of setting up the store using redux-thunk. Okay, let's take a look at this code. Okay, this is again root reducer thunk. Comes here, I import that. I have already added that to my package.json. I'm going to import apply middleware from Redux in my line number 1 and call it over here. It is what we could call enhancer, or you could directly pass this apply middleware function to here. Or instead of that, you could just create the variable. The question is, can Redux, does Redux allow us to have more than one middleware? Yes, we could do that. Instead of just passing the thunk as the only parameter, we could do it this way. For instance, you could create an array of your middleware. Let's say thunk is one of them, and whatever is the next middleware that you could see here, you could add here, and then you could pass that array to apply middleware. So apply middleware is a function which could receive one single middleware as its parameter, or a list of middlewares. So what we need over here is just a simple thunk, as you see. That's why I don't actually need to pass an array. Okay, this is the next step. But again, another feature that redux-thunk has is helpers. It allows us to have, similar to me creating a groups API in my utils over here, these are helper functions actually, you know, but I have put them inside my utils. So, but there are some specific utils that we usually need almost everywhere. If it is the case, you could use helper functions of thunk. I'm not going to talk about it a lot here, but if you want to, it's another topic that needs more time. But if you are interested, just this is the way that you could set up the helper technology, you know, the helper feature of redux-thunk. This is how you could do that. So what it does, it allows you to have some helper functions. So do I have a helper function over here inside my code base? Yes. So let's just say store create helpers.js. For instance, for GraphQL requests, I need to have a helper function. So these helper functions fetch GraphQL requests and history objects. Not only helper functions, helpers, whatever it is, the helper object of history, the helper function of request or fetch or whatever. The whole thing over here is just, we need this fetch function whenever we want to, you know, send XHR request. So I no longer need to import fetch in my code. All I need to do is just to use this fetch in my redux, you know, thunk helpers. I'm going to show you how it works in a minute. So this is how you could set it up. You could read all of this code and we could discuss about it later.